The dust in that attic was thick enough to choke on. Every time I moved, a cloud billowed up, smelling like old paper, mothballs, and forgotten dreams. I was wearing an N95 mask. This was pre-pandemic, mind you, so I looked ridiculous. But even the mask couldn't keep the history of that house out of my lungs. I was there because my grandmother, Eleanor, had passed away 6 months earlier, and my Aunt Carol, her only living child, had finally decided to clear out the house for sale. "Don't waste your time up here, honey," Carol had told me over a lukewarm cup of coffee downstairs, her voice brittle with a mix of grief and exasperation. "It's all just junk. Sentimental junk, maybe, but still junk. The estate lawyer is already taking care of the important things. The jewelry, the bonds, the land deed. That's all set. You're just doing me a favor by clearing out the stuff nobody wants to move." I was happy to do it. Grandma Eleanor was the kind of person who collected stories along with everything else. She wasn't a hoarder, exactly, but she certainly saw potential in objects the rest of the world considered trash. A chipped porcelain doll, a stack of sheet music from the 1920s, a globe where the Soviet Union was still a thing. Each item had a meticulously detailed, if slightly exaggerated story attached to it. And now, all those stories were mine to sift through. The attic was massive. It spanned the entire footprint of the old Victorian, a dark, V-shaped cavern illuminated by a single bare bulb hanging from the peak of the rafters. It was organized chaos. Stacks of newspapers yellowed into brittle slabs, steamer trunks plastered with faded travel stickers, and furniture draped in white sheets, resembling ghostly gatherings. I started with the boxes closest to the trapdoor, mostly holiday decorations. Tangled lights, crushed tinsel, and an army of ceramic snowmen. Then I saw it. Tucked away in the darkest corner, behind a hulking 4-drawer wooden filing cabinet that smelled faintly of cedar and mold, was a chest. It wasn't large, maybe 3 feet wide and 2 feet tall, but it was striking. It wasn't the kind of pirate ship chest you see in movies. It was a campaign chest, the type used by military officers or wealthy travelers in the 19th century. Made of dark, heavy wood, mahogany, maybe. It was reinforced with brass bands, tarnished almost black, and the corners were protected by thick brass caps. There were scratches and dents everywhere, evidence of a long, rough life on ships or trains. A massive iron lock, rusty but still functional, was set into the front. I managed to drag it out, the sound of the metal scraping against the unfinished floorboards echoing in the silence. It weighed a ton, heavier than it looked, suggesting it was full of something dense. Not linens, not clothes. Maybe books, or, more thrillingly, tools. I went downstairs to ask Aunt Carol about it. She was scrolling through her phone, looking utterly exhausted. "Aunt Carol, did you know about the campaign chest in the far corner of the attic?" She didn't look up immediately. "Chest? Oh, that thing. Yes, I remember. It's been up there forever. Probably since before I was born. Mom always kept it locked. She told me once, when I was a kid trying to get into everything, that it was full of her father's old uniforms and military papers. Absolutely worthless stuff. Just old wool and moth-eaten documents. I never bothered with it. We don't even have the key anymore. Honestly, honey, just leave it. If you can't open it, leave it. The buyer can deal with the trash." "So, worthless?" I pressed, feeling a little spark of intrigue. "Totally worthless," she confirmed, finally looking up and giving me a tired, dismissive wave. "Trust me, that chest has no value. Just leave it. If you have to break it, just put the pieces in a trash bag. Less for me to worry about." That was all the permission I needed. No value is exactly what someone says when they haven't looked inside something for 50 years. The fact that Grandma Eleanor, a woman who rarely threw anything away, kept this specific, heavy, locked chest hidden in the deepest part of the attic suggested the opposite of worthlessness. It suggested importance. And the detail about her father's old uniforms? Grandma Eleanor's father, my great-grandfather, had died in the 1940s. A chest full of military memorabilia that, old, if well-preserved, could be fascinating. If nothing else, a history lesson. I went to the garage and rooted through Grandpa George's old toolbox. He was a practical man who loved finding a solution to any physical problem. I found a small, heavy-duty crowbar and a set of chisels. Back in the attic, I placed the crowbar carefully into the seam between the lid and the body of the chest, right next to the massive, intimidating lock. I leveraged the bar, testing the wood. It was solid, incredibly resistant. The first two attempts only resulted in loud, protesting creaks from the hinges. I paused, knowing I was about to violate a very old secret. I took a deep breath. With a final, violent heave, I put all my weight into the crowbar. The air was split by a screech of tortured metal, followed by the sickening, satisfying crack of the wood around the lock mechanism finally giving way. The lid sprang open an inch, held only by the resistance of the aged hinges. The smell that escaped wasn't musty wool or moldy paper. It was a sharp, metallic odor mixed with something faintly sweet, like old wood polish. I threw the lid all the way back. I peered inside, my heart doing a nervous little flutter. My initial impression of worthless uniforms was instantly, gloriously wrong. The top layer wasn't fabric, it was paper, but not military papers. Lying neatly on top, covering everything else, was a single, thick, leather-bound book. It was a ledger, the kind an accountant or a banker would use. Its spine cracked and the pages yellowed. I lifted it out carefully. The cover was blank, but when I opened it, the pages were covered in neat, looping script, dated from the late 1940s to the early 1970s. It wasn't a diary. It was a meticulous record, a detailed inventory, but the descriptions were cryptic. 1916 GS B, 1888 CS M, 1909 DF A. Next to each entry was a value written in pencil, usually a small number followed by the letter X or E with a very early date, then a dash and a much larger crossed-out figure, followed by an updated, incredibly recent value written in ink. These weren't just lists. They were valuation records. Beneath the ledger, protected by a layer of fine, red velvet that must have been glued to the bottom of the lid decades ago, was the true treasure. The contents of the chest were arranged in rows of small, dark wooden trays. Each tray fitted into the next, like a nested set of boxes. And in these trays, cushioned in what looked like faded purple satin, were dozens, maybe hundreds, of small, circular objects. They glinted even in the dim light of the single bulb. They were coins, not a jar of random pocket change. These were organized, labeled, and clearly cared for with extraordinary attention. They were a collection. The first tray I picked up held coins that were mostly silver, some so dark they looked black, and a few with a vibrant, almost iridescent rainbow sheen, the result of decades of untouched toning. I slid a finger over a small square label taped to the satin lining. The neat handwriting, my grandmother's, I realized, the same precise loops as in the ledger, read 1853, seated Liberty, $50, arrows and rays variety. Another tag next to a different coin simply said 1893 S. Morgan. I didn't know much about coins, but I knew enough to know that Morgan dollars were popular. And the S meant San Francisco Mint, and the 1893 S date was one of the key dates. The second tray held gold, actual, glowing, heavy gold. Small, beautiful discs that looked like they belonged in a museum exhibit. They had a weight and density I'd never felt before, warm in my palm. My breath hitched. I picked up one of the gold coins. It was a US coin, maybe half an inch wide. The date was 1851. It was a gold dollar, a tiny relic from the California gold rush era. The tag next to it read, Type 1 gold dollar. My Aunt Carol said it had no value. My grandmother Eleanor had hidden a secret, and it was sitting right here, shining under a bare bulb in a dusty attic. This wasn't junk. This was history, condensed and preserved. I quickly flipped through the ledger again, now understanding the cryptic entries. 1888, CS. M probably meant 1888 Carson City silver dollar, Morgan. I looked at the most recent valuation date scribbled in ink on the ledger page. It was a figure that made my head spin, a figure with 6 digits. My grandmother had known exactly what she had, and she had kept it a total secret. Why? Why tell her only child it was worthless? The questions piled up faster than the dust motes dancing in the light. This wasn't just a collection. This was a mystery wrapped in brass and mahogany. The silence in the attic was suddenly oppressive, the only sound the nervous thrumming in my own ears. I carefully closed the chest lid, the metallic screech a reminder of my violent entry. I didn't want to alert Aunt Carol downstairs. If this collection was truly worth what the ledger hinted at, a six-figure sum, then Carol's casual dismissal of it as worthless junk took on an entirely new, unsettling meaning. Did she truly not know? Or was she playing some kind of long game? Given her reputation as a practical, somewhat grasping person, I leaned toward genuine ignorance, but the possibility of deception was a cold knot in my stomach. I decided to proceed with absolute secrecy. The chest and its contents were now my private, immediate responsibility. I spent the next hour moving all the boxes around the chest back into their original places, effectively reburying the mahogany box. I wiped down the crowbar, returned it to the garage, and then went back up, bringing only my backpack and a flashlight. I pulled the ledger out first, knowing I had to understand the scope of what I was holding before I could even begin to process the coins themselves. The book wasn't just a list. It was an artifact of my grandmother's obsession. Each coin had not only its basic identifying information, like year, mint mark, and denomination, but also a cryptic handwritten grade. Terms like AU58, MS63, and PR65 were scrawled next to entries. I'd seen those designations on pawnshop signs and auction listings before. They referred to the coin's condition or grade. What struck me most was the level of detail, the sheer intellectual rigor Grandma Eleanor had applied. It wasn't just a hobby, it was a serious, lifelong pursuit. The oldest entries were from 1947, when she would have been barely 20 years old. The last entry was dated 3 months before she passed away. This collection wasn't something she randomly acquired. It was something she built, coin by coin, for almost 80 years. The crossouts and updated valuations in ink showed a continuous engagement with the market, a constant re-evaluation of the collection's worth. She was a secret, high-level collector, operating entirely under the radar of her family. I sat on a dusty footstool, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, and opened one of the nested trays. The sheer variety was stunning. There were large cents from the early 1800s, heavy copper pieces featuring Liberty with flowing hair, their details surprisingly sharp. There were V-nickels, 3-cent pieces, and half dimes, denominations that no longer even existed. Each coin was a tiny window into a specific moment in American history. My eye was drawn to a single silver dollar, housed in a sealed, clear plastic holder from a grading service, which meant she had already sent it off for professional authentication. The label read, 1901 O Morgan Silver Dollar, PCGS MS63. The O for the New Orleans Mint, a famous mint mark. But what really mattered was the PCGS MS63. That meant it had been independently judged as mint state, a high grade. The valuation next to a similar entry in the ledger was over $1,000 for a single coin. And then I found the key piece, the pivot point of the entire collection, tucked into the very last tray beneath the gold pieces. It was a coin slightly larger than a quarter, dark with age, but with an incredibly detailed, sharp strike. It was in an older round coin holder, and the handwritten label was slightly faded. It was a U.S. half eagle, a $5 gold piece, dated 1844, but the key was the mint mark, C, Charlotte, North Carolina. The tag read, 1844 C, $5 half eagle, key date. I cross-referenced it with the ledger. The entry for 1844 HE, C, was the highest value entry in the entire book. The most recent inked figure, which had replaced 3 earlier, smaller figures, was $85,000 for one coin. A gasp escaped me, muffled by the mask. This wasn't just a collection. This was a small fortune, hidden in an attic my aunt had dismissed as junk. The realization brought a rush of adrenaline, quickly followed by a heavy dose of ethical anxiety. What was my role here? My grandmother had kept this secret, not just from Aunt Carol, but from everyone, including me. Did finding it obligate me to reveal it? And to whom? Legally, the estate had been settled. The known assets had been distributed. This was an unknown asset, a hidden treasure. Aunt Carol was the sole heir to the house and its contents. Did that include the contents of a chest she explicitly called worthless and told me to discard? I went back downstairs, the weight of the secret pressing on me. Aunt Carol was now on a video call, arguing with a real estate agent about the closing date. Her side of the conversation was all sharp impatience. I don't care about the inspection. I care about the cash. Get it done, she snapped before hanging up. Make any progress, sweetie? She asked without warmth, reaching for her wine glass. Just sorting through some of the smaller boxes, I lied smoothly, surprised by how easy it was. I found a few old photographs and some chipped dinnerware. Nothing of value. That old chest, I couldn't get it open. The lock is totally rusted. It's really heavy, though. Maybe we should just leave it for the moving crew. This was a subtle test. Carol waved her hand dismissively again. Whatever you want, dear. If it's locked, it's garbage. Don't worry about it. Just keep clearing out the light stuff. I need that house empty. Her total lack of curiosity solidified my decision. I couldn't tell her yet. If she was genuinely ignorant, telling her now would introduce a sudden, massive liability into her life and potentially into mine, as she might panic and mishandle the collection. If she wasn't ignorant, and this was some kind of elaborate avoidance tactic, I needed more information before I revealed my hand. I decided to secure the collection first. That evening, I told Aunt Carol I needed to head back to my apartment for a few days to work, but promised to return the following week to finish the attic. I needed to move the chest out of the house. I couldn't leave $200,000 worth of gold and silver sitting in an unlocked attic for some unsuspecting mover to stumble upon. The plan was simple, insane, and high risk. The chest was too heavy and bulky to carry down the main staircase without attracting attention. I'd have to use the old, rickety back staircase which connected the attic to the rarely used mudroom by the kitchen. The chest weighed perhaps 150 pounds, maybe more. I knew I couldn't carry it. I could, however, slide it. I waited until 2 a.m. Carol always took a sleeping pill and was dead to the world by 1 a.m. I put on dark clothes, pulled my mask back on, and carried 2 heavy-duty furniture blankets and a coil of nylon rope up the back stairs. I carefully wrapped the chest in the blankets, securing it with the rope. I opened the attic door just enough to slide the bundled chest onto the first landing of the back stairs. The wood groaned under the weight, a terrifying loud noise in the dead silence. I froze, listening. Nothing, only the distant hum of the city. I spent the next 20 minutes lowering the chest, inch by painful, agonizing inch, down the steep, narrow flight of stairs. It was a process of controlled falling, the heavy chest sliding on the blankets, me acting as a human brake with the rope. By the time it reached the mudroom floor, I was drenched in sweat and my muscles were screaming. But the chest was out of the attic. The final hurdle was moving it from the mudroom, through the dark garage, and into the back of my small SUV. I used an old dolly I found in the garage to move it, another risky 20 minutes of scraping, pushing, and agonizing silence. By 3 a.m., the campaign chest was secured under a blanket in the back of my car, and I was on the highway, driving away from the ancestral home and towards my own small apartment. My entire world turned upside down by a collection of antique metal discs. I knew I had crossed a legal and ethical line, taking an object before its ownership was settled, but I felt a powerful, almost spiritual obligation to the memory of my grandmother to protect her secret. The next step, finding out the real value of the collection, and more importantly, why my grandmother had hidden it for so long. The ledger didn't tell the whole story. The chest sat in the middle of my small, sparse living room, an imposing, dark secret in my otherwise modern, minimalist space. It looked completely out of place, like a piece of salvaged history dropped onto a polished concrete floor. For the next 3 days, my life revolved around it. I called in sick to my job, telling my boss I had a severe flu. The truth was, I was obsessed, spending every waking hour trying to unravel the mystery of Eleanor's hidden hoard. The first step was confirming the actual market value of what I possessed. The 6-digit figure in the ledger was intriguing, but could be outdated, inflated, or simply wishful thinking. I started with the most valuable pieces listed in the ledger. The gold coins, specifically that $85,000 1844 half eagle. I couldn't risk taking the actual coin anywhere, so I used the flashlight and a high-resolution camera to take meticulous photographs. I researched online forums, auction records, and numismatic databases, the specialized world of coin collecting. What I quickly discovered was that my grandmother's grading was incredibly accurate, sometimes even conservative. She wasn't just a collector, she was an expert. The 1844 Sea Half-Eagle was indeed a major key date, highly sought after because the Charlotte Mint had a very low mintage that year, and most of the coins that survived were heavily worn. If my grandmother's specimen was as pristine as her AU-58 grade suggested, the $85,000 valuation from the ledger's last ink entry might even be low, possibly nearing $100,000 in today's market. Then, there was the 1893 S Morgan silver dollar. The S mint mark, combined with the 1893 date, made it a legend among collectors. Only 100,000 were minted, and many were melted down. A high-grade example, which Eleanor seemed to possess, routinely sold for 5 figures. When I added up just the 10 most valuable coins noted in the ledger, the total reached well over $250,000. Aunt Carol's worthless junk was, in fact, a substantial financial inheritance. But the more I researched the value, the more the central mystery deepened. Why the secrecy? Grandma Eleanor was not poor. She lived comfortably off a teacher's pension and investments. Why hide such a major asset from her only child and everyone else? It didn't make sense as a simple investment. She could have kept it in a bank-safe deposit box and handled the transfer legally. The act of hiding it in a dusty attic, telling her daughter it was garbage, suggested a motive far more complicated than simple tax avoidance. I returned my focus to the ledger, looking for clues beyond the financial details. That's when I noticed a pattern in the early entries, the ones from the late 1940s and 1950s. Beside many of the descriptions were small, faded pencil markings, DT, M, or RPS. These weren't part of the grading system. They looked like initials. I began cross-referencing these initials with the people in old photos I vaguely remembered seeing at Grandma Eleanor's house. I drew a complete blank. They weren't family members. They weren't even local friends. I turned back to the gold coins, and specifically, the very oldest ones. I realized many of them were not American. There were tiny, beautiful pieces stamped with eagles and kings, likely pre-20th century European gold. One, a stunning micro-sized piece, was labeled in Eleanor's hand as a 1688 Spanish escudo. Next to that entry in the ledger, under the cryptic initials, were the letters JHR. This time, there was a date next to the initials, 1949 Berlin. Berlin, 1949. The hair stood up on the back of my neck. That was 3 years after the end of World War II, right at the beginning of the Cold War, and the infamous Berlin airlift. My grandmother had been a very young woman then. What was a young American woman doing acquiring Spanish gold coins in post-war Berlin? And from someone with the initials JH? I decided to start digging into Eleanor's past, something I hadn't needed to do before. All I ever knew was that she met my grandfather after the war when she returned to the States and got her teaching degree. I drove back to her house, knowing Aunt Carol would be out with the real estate agent. I used the time to systematically go through the non-attic spaces that had been deemed cleared. I found a small box in the back of her bedroom closet, a plain shoebox hidden beneath a stack of old scarves. Inside were letters, tied with faded blue ribbons. They weren't from my grandfather. They were addressed to "My dearest Eleanor," and signed simply J. The postmarks confirmed my suspicion. They were from various European cities, Paris, London, but mostly Berlin, between 1947 and 1950. The handwriting was elegant, but hurried. I started reading the first one. It wasn't a love letter in the traditional sense, but an exchange that hinted at a dangerous partnership. J spoke often of the inventory, the transfers, and the need for liquidity in a changing currency landscape. One paragraph, in particular, made my blood run cold. The transfer of the escudos is finalized. It was nearly compromised by the military police at Checkpoint Alpha. I had to use the pre-arranged cover story. Your side of the operation must maintain absolute silence regarding the source. No one can know that these coins are the remainder. If they link the coins to the list, we are finished. Do not spend them, Eleanor. Hold them for the others. They are our insurance. The others. The remainder. prearranged cover story. This wasn't about a coin collection. This was about a network, a secret mission, and a high-stakes transfer of wealth during one of the most fraught political periods in modern history. The escudo in the ledger, the 1688 Spanish gold coin, was the key piece mentioned in the letter. My grandmother wasn't just a collector. She was a custodian of a fund, possibly tied to a post-war intelligence operation or something far darker. I had stumbled into a story of espionage, high finance, and political intrigue, all concealed within a collection of rare American coinage. The reason for the secrecy became terrifyingly clear. The value wasn't just monetary. It was tied to the safety and survival of people she called the others. She didn't hide it to cheat the taxman. She hid it because revealing it could have brought down a clandestine network or put a target on her own back. The next crucial step was finding out who Jay was and who the others were before Aunt Carol's fast tracking of the house sale inadvertently unearthed any more of my grandmother's dangerous secrets. The coin collection wasn't just a windfall, it was a ticking time capsule. The letters from Jay were the missing piece of the puzzle, transforming the coin collection from a mere financial asset into the remnants of a Cold War mystery. I took the letters and the ledger back to my apartment, spreading them out on the floor like pieces of an ancient map. I had to focus on the JH and J connection. My grandmother's meticulously maintained secrets meant there had to be a point of origin, a way to trace the initials back to a full name. The most significant clue was the consistent cross-referencing of the coins with the European cities and the dates. The collection's existence seemed tied to a series of transfers that happened right after the war. I started digging into my grandmother's early history, using the few documents I could find online. Her passport application from the late 1940s confirmed she had worked for the U.S. government overseas, but not for the military. The field listed was Civilian Support Staff, Department of Cultural Restoration, a seemingly innocuous title. I used the search engine to cross-reference Department of Cultural Restoration with Berlin 1949. What came up was a handful of archived articles about the Monuments Men, the group tasked with recovering art and cultural artifacts stolen by the Nazis, but also several less publicized programs aimed at identifying and repatriating assets that belonged to Jewish families and political dissidents who had fled or perished during the Holocaust. These were incredibly sensitive operations, often involving the quiet transfer of liquid wealth like gold and currency. The J in the letters might not be JH, but the coincidence was too strong. I went back to the ledger and the entry for the Spanish escudo, 1688, Spanish escudo, JH, R, 1949, Berlin. I wondered if R stood for something, perhaps a surname or a code name. I pulled up my grandmother's birth name and marriage records. I knew she was a very private person, but she wouldn't have left a clue like this for no reason. I looked at the initials again, DT, RP, JH. I realized they were always attached to coins dated before 1930, and usually to coins with a European origin or significant American key dates that would have been valuable worldwide. These weren't coins my grandmother bought. These were coins she received or was holding. My breakthrough came when I shifted my search to the names of known political and cultural figures who fled Europe and settled in the U.S. immediately post-war, often with their assets stripped. The search term, German émigré assets recovered post-war, led me to an obscure historical society archive. There, I found a short paper detailing a legal dispute over a gold transfer in 1952. The details were thin, but the key players were listed: two wealthy German families, the Thielmans and the Proskauers, who had lost everything under the Nazi regime. The paper mentioned a small, independent intermediary in the U.S. tasked with managing the recovery of their non-liquidated wealth. The names immediately clicked. DT could be Thielman, RP could be Proskauer. I went back to the ledger, and the entries next to the DT and RP initials were for exceptionally high-value, small, and easily transportable coins, tiny gold dollars and European fractional gold pieces. These were literally liquid assets intended for quick transfer and dispersal. My grandmother wasn't just working for cultural restoration. She was, at minimum, running a highly covert financial safe harbor operation. But the central mystery was still J.H.&J. I typed Thielmann Proskauer J.H. Berlin, 1949, into a specialized historical database. I hit gold. A small digitized memoir by a former U.S. military intelligence officer, dated 1998. The officer wrote about a deep-cover agent named Jan Henckel, codename J, who had been instrumental in recovering assets and funneling funds to the families who were targeted by the regime. Henckel operated for the OSS-CIA's early post-war operations. The officer described Henkel's method. He didn't trust banks. They were too easily compromised. He moved value via unique, non-traceable physical objects, mostly rare numismatic items and small-cut diamonds. Jan Henckel, J.H. and J., the man writing the letters to my grandmother, Eleanor. My grandmother, the seemingly quiet schoolteacher, had been the American end of a sensitive, potentially life-saving intelligence operation. She was the one holding the insurance Henckel mentioned, the final, most valuable remnants of the fund, the collection of American key date coins. The secrecy wasn't about avoiding tax. It was about protecting the network, and perhaps Henckel himself, from retribution. If the coins were a fund, where were the beneficiaries? The last letter from J was dated 1950, and it was devastatingly short. They know I'm operating in the East. They followed the money trail. I'm moving deep cover. The coins are secure with you. Remember, the others must not be forgotten. You are their only key now. If I don't contact you by Christmas, assume the worst. My life's work is in that mahogany box. He never contacted her again. My grandmother had spent the next 50 years safeguarding not a coin collection, but a trust. Her mission was to wait. The most recent inked figure in the ledger, the 6-digit one, suddenly wasn't a personal valuation, but an updated fund total. She wasn't an heir, she was a fiduciary. The twist was this: the coin collection wasn't fully mine. It was a fund intended for the others. The collection was a moral, not a purely financial inheritance. I had to find the beneficiaries. I had to finish my grandmother's mission, and I had a terrifying new antagonist, my Aunt Carol, who was unknowingly preparing to sell the house where the secrets of the Proskauers and Thielmanns were buried. I had to work fast before Carol's greed, disguised as efficiency, wiped out all evidence of my grandmother's extraordinary hidden life. The revelation that the coins were not a personal windfall, but a 50-year-old trust fund for the others, changed everything. The stakes were no longer about settling an estate. They were about honor, history, and completing the covert mission of my grandmother, Eleanor, and her mysterious partner, Jan Henckel. My immediate focus shifted from valuation to identification. I needed to find a list of beneficiaries, something more concrete than the cryptic initials in the ledger. I went back to the ledger and the letters, meticulously examining every scrap of paper. I realized the ledger itself was a key to a deeper secret. All the pages detailing the American coin collection, the high-value Morgans, the seeded Liberties, and the key date gold pieces, were relatively clean. But the first 10 pages, the earliest entries from the late 1940s, were different. They were heavily stained, the paper thin from handling, and some entries were completely crossed out with thick black lines. I noticed a slight stiffness in the paper near the spine of the ledger on those early pages. Using a small magnifying glass and the bright light of my phone, I carefully peeled back the stiff edge of the first page. It wasn't the page itself that was stiff. A separate, incredibly thin piece of archival paper had been meticulously pasted over the original. Eleanor had created a false front to her records. I had to assume the pages underneath contained the sensitive information. I carefully used a warm, damp cloth and the precision of a small hobby knife, the kind used for model building, to slowly loosen the adhesive along the spine. It was a painstaking, stressful process. After nearly an hour, I managed to peel back the first page, revealing the original, underlying ledger entry. The difference was staggering. The original entries weren't cryptic, but explicit. Instead of 1916 GSB, the entry read, 1916 Gold Sovereign, UK, held for G. Steiner. Transfer to Bank of Bern, account B4792. initiated by J.H., code Phoenix. G. Steiner, Bank of Bern, Phoenix. It wasn't just a list of coin transfers, it was a clear accounting record for an underground financial network. I quickly peeled back the remaining 9 cover pages. The underlying records detailed the transfer of dozens of small, high-value gold coins to numbered Swiss bank accounts between 1948 and 1953, all managed by Jan Henckel. The initials DT and RP were fully revealed as Dietrich Thielmann and Robert Proskauer, confirming my earlier deduction. But the final 2 uncovered pages, dated 1954, were the most important. They were entirely different from the rest. They listed no coins, no banks, and no dollar amounts. They were titled simply, "The Remaining Trust, Awaiting Resolution, The Others." Underneath this title were 3 names, written in a different hand than Eleanor's, a handwriting that matched the elegant, hurried script of J himself. I. Kessler. Location, Buenos Aires, Argentina. Last known address, 1954. L. Volkov. Location, New York City, USA. Last known address, 1954. M. Henckel. Relationship, sibling of J.H. Location, unknown. Last known contact, 1950. This was it. The list of the beneficiaries. The 250,000 plus in collection of American rare coins was not meant for a Swiss account. It was meant to be the last, crucial lifeline for these 3 individuals, likely people who could not be helped through standard banking channels. The coins were the final physical payload. My mission, my grandmother's legacy, was to find these people, or their living descendants, and deliver the trust. The problem? The information was 70 years old. I. Kessler in Buenos Aires, L. Volkov in NYC, M. Henckel, last heard from in 1950, they were likely deceased. I would need to find their grandchildren or great-grandchildren. Before I could start the massive undertaking of genealogical research, I received a text from Aunt Carol. The real estate inspection was scheduled for the next day, and she needed me to come back to the house immediately to collect the last of the attic debris and move it to a dumpster she had rented. Specifically, she mentioned that locked old mahogany chest I told you to ignore. A sense of panic washed over me. I had secured the chest, but she still saw its space as belonging to the house. If she found the empty, scratched-up space where the chest had been and realized I had lied about not being able to open it, her suspicions would be instantly roused. Worse, she would find the huge, gouged mark on the floorboards where I had dragged the heavy chest out. The house was being sold, and any damage had to be explained. I knew I couldn't simply put the chest back. That would risk the entire collection. I needed a convincing cover story and a diversion. I thought back to what Carol believed was in the chest. Her father's old uniforms and military papers. I drove immediately to a military surplus store and bought 2 heavy wool WW-IRA coats, a few moth-eaten canvas bags, and some replica military paper documents, simple things like ration forms and service records. I raced back to my grandmother's house and went straight up to the attic. I arranged the coats and papers in an old, empty cardboard box and then placed the box exactly where the campaign chest had been. When Aunt Carol arrived an hour later, she was already stressed. "I need this attic pristine by tomorrow, sweetie. Did you finally get that old chest out?" "Yes," I said, pointing to the empty box. I took a hammer to the lock. "You were right, it was just junk." I couldn't fit the actual wooden chest into my car, but I managed to stuff the contents, the old moth-eaten military uniforms, into that box. "I'll take the box now. The rest of the wood pieces are too rotten. They should go straight into the dumpster you rented." Carol barely glanced at the box. She was too busy inspecting the floorboards where I had made the gouge. "What is this?" she demanded, pointing a polished leather boot at the mark. "Oh, that," I said, feigning an innocent sigh. That's why I couldn't move the chest. I think the leg of the filing cabinet was wedged right over where the chest was. I had to yank the cabinet to get to it. Must have scratched the old wood. "I can sand it down and stain it tonight if you like." Carol sighed, rubbing her temples. "No, just leave it. The buyers are taking the house as is. It's just more trouble than it's worth. Just get rid of that box of garbage." Her total lack of interest, the confirmation that the house was being sold as is, and the successful deception gave me the window I needed. I had eliminated the immediate threat of discovery. Now, Armed with the names Kessler, Volkov, and Henckel, I had to execute the final, crucial step of my grandmother's secret mission. The collection was safe, the house was being sold, and Aunt Carol was none the wiser, having successfully dismissed the six-figure trust fund as moth-eaten military uniforms. Now began the true work, tracking down the three beneficiaries of Eleanor and Jan Henckel's Cold War trust. I had to find a living descendant of I. Kessler, L. Volkov, or M. Henckel. My timeline was tight. The weight of this moral obligation pressed on me, urging swift action. I started with the most common name, L. Volkov, last known in New York City in 1954. Using my grandmother's exact location and time period, I focused my search on public records and immigration archives from the 1950s. After 3 days of hitting dead ends, I refined my search to include middle names and birth years, cross-referencing with passenger manifests. I finally found a match, Lucas Volkov, born 1912, who arrived in 1948. He was listed in the 1955 NYC directory as a musical instrument repairman. A few more clicks led me to an obituary from 1988. He had one surviving daughter, Sophia Volkov. Sophia was still alive, living upstate, and listed as a retired music teacher. The connection was startling. My grandmother was a retired school teacher, and the beneficiary's daughter was also a retired school teacher. Lucas Volkov's life had been successfully rebuilt, likely thanks to the earlier funds transferred by Jan Henckel. I hesitated to contact her directly, needing to verify the story first. The next name, I. Kessler, was harder. The Buenos Aires lead was cold. The only thing I found was a mention in an old Argentine newspaper about an Ilya Kessler, a retired architect who died in the 1970s, leaving no known immediate family. This was a dead end. 2 out of 3 potential beneficiaries seemed to have had their trails run cold or were untraceable. The final name was the most unsettling, M. Henckel, sibling of J.H. This was Jan Henckel's family, the one person he truly entrusted to Eleanor. I scoured the memoir written by the U.S. intelligence officer, looking for any reference to Jan's family. I found a single footnote. Agent Henckel's only known relative, a sister, Miriam, disappeared into East Germany in 1950, shortly after Henckel went deep cover. Status: unknown. Miriam Henckel. She was lost behind the Iron Curtain, and the coins were likely meant to facilitate her escape or support her survival. The key was the date, 1950. The coin collection was the last safety net for the family of the man who risked everything. I decided to start with the strongest lead, Sophia Volkov. I couldn't simply call her and say, "Your father was part of a Cold War trust, and I have $250,000 of gold for you." I needed proof and a controlled setting. I wrote a formal, concise letter addressed to Sophia, saying I had recovered some documents related to her father's early immigration from a family member who worked in post-war cultural restoration, and that I urgently needed to discuss the contents of a ledger dated 1954. I sent it by certified mail, including a single key photocopy from the ledger, the entry for Lucas Volkov's transfer in the 1950s using his full name. 2 days later, my phone rang. The voice on the other end was clear, measured, and skeptical. "This is Sophia Volkov. The letter you sent me, it mentioned my father's old ledger. I have one question for you. Do you know what Phoenix means?" My breath caught. "Yes," I answered immediately, thinking back to the deciphered ledger entry. It was the code name used by Jan Henckel for the initial asset transfers. There was a long silence on the line. "Then I think we need to talk," she said, her voice softening with the weight of memory. My father was never an instrument repairman. That was his cover. He taught me 2 things: never trust a bank and always remember the code name, Phoenix. I spent the next 2 hours on the phone with Sophia. She confirmed that her father had received assistance from a network run by a very brave man named John, which allowed him to restart his life in the U.S. He had always believed there was a final emergency fund for the others that was never fully dispersed. He passed this story down to Sophia as a moral obligation, telling her that if anyone ever came looking with the details of the ledger, they were to be trusted. I explained everything: the campaign chest, Aunt Carol's ignorance, my grandmother Eleanor's role as the silent custodian, and the staggering value of the coins. I told her about the other two names, Kessler and Miriam Henckel, and the moral mission to find them. Sophia's response was unexpected and profound. My father rebuilt his life. He received what he needed. The coin fund, as you call it, was meant to finish the mission, to save the others. She then dropped the final, stunning twist. I have a family friend who is a retired journalist specializing in Cold War disappearances. I can't trace Miriam, but he can. The money, the value, is nothing compared to the chance to save Jan Henkel's own sister. We agreed to meet the next day. The collection was transferred to a secure vault I had already established, and I brought the ledger and letters to our meeting. Sophia and I spent the day planning. We decided to liquidate only the most common, easily graded silver dollars from the collection, about $50,000 worth, to hire the journalist and fund the global search for M. Henckel. The $85,000 1844 C half eagle, the key date that started this all, was returned to the chest and remains untouched. It isn't just a coin. It's a monument to the legacy of Eleanor and Jan, a piece of insurance still waiting for its rightful owner. I never told Aunt Carol the truth. She sold the house and got her asking price, satisfied with her profit, unknowingly leaving behind a 7-decade-long moral treasure hunt. The worthless junk of the mahogany chest has now taken on its ultimate value, not as money, but as the active catalyst for completing a crucial mission of historical justice. My life has been completely rerouted. I'm now a part-time investigator, helping Sophia and the journalist track down the final two names on my grandmother's secret list. The attic was dusty, but the secrets it held were pure gold. The mission continues.